It began 3 months after I moved into the building. A modest two-bedroom unit with hardwood floors and decent light. Apartment 4B was supposed to be my sanctuary after years of roommate chaos and sublet nightmares. I worked remotely as a data analyst, kept to myself, maintained reasonable hours. I was the ideal tenant, but I had the misfortune of living directly above Margaret Holloway, a woman whose entire existence seemed predicated on the belief that suffering was a competitive sport and she intended to win. The first complaint arrived via a passive-aggressive note slipped under my door, written in her spidery handwriting on floral stationery that reeked of lavender and malice. Your constant stomping is unbearable. Some of us have jobs that require rest. I had been home for 2 days, had walked to the kitchen twice, and had spent 16 hours at my desk in socks. I dismissed it as a misunderstanding. The second complaint went to the landlord. She claimed I was running an industrial operation in my unit, that I played loud music at all hours, that I had guests who partied until dawn. None of it was true. I lived alone, worked in near silence with noise-canceling headphones, and hadn't had a visitor in weeks. When I provided my landlord with time-stamped work logs and offered to install decibel monitors, he waved it off as a personality conflict. Margaret's always been particular, he said, which I would later understand was code for untouchable long-time tenant who makes my life hell if I don't appease her. But Margaret wasn't satisfied with letters. She began a campaign. She knocked on the doors of neighbors I'd never met, spinning elaborate fictions about my depravity. She told Mrs. Chun in 3A that I was running a drug operation. She told the young couple in 5B that I was a registered sex offender. She printed flyers, actual flyers, and distributed them in the lobby, calling for a tenant meeting to address the safety concerns I posed. The photo she used was pulled from my LinkedIn profile, circled in red Sharpie like a wanted poster. I watched from my window as she held court in the building's courtyard, her arms animated, her voice carrying. She wore her victimhood like couture, performing her grievances with the confidence of someone who had weaponized complaints for decades. And I realized with creeping dread that she was good at this. Very good. The inflection point came on a Tuesday. I returned home from a rare in-person meeting to find my apartment ice cold. The heat had been shut off, not a malfunction, deliberately shut off at the breaker in the basement utility room, which required a key only tenants and management possessed. My landlord claimed ignorance. Margaret, when I knocked on her door to ask if she'd seen anything suspicious, smiled with such naked satisfaction that I felt my stomach turn. "Maybe the building is trying to tell you something," she said sweetly, her pale eyes glittering. "Maybe you're not a good fit here." 2 days later, I received an email from a potential client, a major contract I'd been courting for months, withdrawing their offer. The reason, vaguely stated, involved concerns about professionalism raised by a third party. I made calls. I pulled threads. Eventually, I discovered that someone had sent an anonymous email to their HR department, alleging that I had a history of workplace harassment and unstable behavior. The email had been sent from a library computer, untraceable, but the phrasing, the word choices, bore Margaret's signature verbosity. She had reached into my professional life. She was trying to destroy my livelihood. I sat in my cold apartment that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to her television blaring beneath me, and I felt something shift. The fear, the anxiety, the desperate hope that rationality and decency would prevail, it all evaporated. In its place was something colder, sharper. Margaret had chosen to make me her project, her enemy, her prey. I decided to return the favor. but with a precision she couldn't comprehend. Margaret's greatest weakness was her devotion to rules, but only as weapons, never as constraints on her own behavior. She filed noise complaints obsessively, but ran an illegal Airbnb out of her second bedroom. She demanded the HOA enforce pet policies while harboring 3 undeclared cats. She railed against parking violations while her guests consistently took handicap spots. She was a monument to hypocrisy, and hypocrisy leaves a paper trail. I began with research. Public records showed she'd been delinquent on property taxes twice, settled both times with payment plans she'd violated. Her Airbnb, active under a pseudonym, had dozens of reviews, evidence of a clear lease violation and unreported income. I cross-referenced her social media, where she boasted about her side hustle, and posted photos of her rental unit with identifiable building features visible in the background. I filed an anonymous tip with the IRS regarding her unreported rental income, attaching screenshots and booking records I'd pulled from cached web pages. I submitted a formal complaint to the building's HOA about her lease violations, complete with documentation and time-stamped photos of her Airbnb guests entering and leaving. I reported her to the city's short-term rental enforcement division, which had recently begun cracking down due to housing shortages. Then I turned to her coalition. I created a bland, untraceable email account and reached out to Mrs. Chun, gently asking if she'd verified the claims Margaret had made about me, attaching my clean background check and a polite note expressing confusion about the misunderstanding. I did the same with the couple in 5B, adding a link to a news article about defamation lawsuits. I didn't accuse Margaret directly. I simply planted seeds of doubt, let them question her credibility. Finally, I installed a wireless decibel monitor in my apartment, synced to a cloud server, creating an unimpeachable record that my unit produced less noise than the ambient building average. I sent the data to the landlord with a polite request for clarification on Margaret's complaints and a subtle mention of harassment statutes. It took 3 weeks for the architecture to collapse on her, and when it did, it was spectacular. The IRS audit notice arrived first. I didn't see it, of course, but I heard her on the phone in the hallway, her voice shrill and panicked, arguing with someone about mistakes and misunderstandings. The HOA followed up with a formal violation notice, demanding she cease her short-term rental operation within 10 days or face fines escalating to $500 per day. The city's enforcement office piled on, adding their own penalties and a potential hearing. Her Airbnb account was suspended after a flurry of complaints. Not from me directly, but from a coordinated effort I'd orchestrated using burner emails and VPN-routed connections, each citing legitimate safety concerns based on her own listing photos showing code violations like blocked fire exits and non-functional smoke detectors. The neighbors turned. Mrs. Chun stopped returning her calls. The couple in 5B filed their own noise complaint against her for her television volume. The landlord, exhausted by the cascading chaos and the liability she represented, served her with a lease non-renewal notice. I watched it unfold from my window, my coffee growing cold as Margaret paced the courtyard. Phone pressed to her ear, her face red and blotchy. She looked smaller somehow, deflated. The power she'd wielded, social, institutional, had evaporated. She was alone. The moving van arrived on a Wednesday night, 3 weeks before her lease officially ended. She negotiated an early exit, likely unable to bear the weight of the building's sudden hostility. I watched from my darkened window as she supervised the loading, barking orders at the movers, her voice hoarse. She made 4 trips to her car, each time glancing up at my window. On the final trip, Our eyes met. She stood there in the sodium glow of the parking lot lights, a box labeled kitchen in her arms, and for a long moment we simply stared at each other. She knew. I could see it in the way her mouth tightened, the way her eyes narrowed. She knew I was the architect of her unraveling, even if she couldn't trace a single action back to me. And in that knowledge, in her impotent rage, I felt a satisfaction so profound it was almost physical. I raised my coffee mug in a silent toast. She turned away, loaded the box, and climbed into her car. The moving van pulled out at 11:47 p.m. By midnight, apartment 3B was empty. I never saw Margaret Holloway again. The new tenant who moved in a month later was a quiet graduate student who baked cookies and apologized for breathing too loudly. My sanctuary was reclaimed, and in the silent hours of the night, when I heard the building settle and creak, I smiled knowing that monsters don't always roar. Sometimes they simply wait, calculate, and when the moment is right, they dismantle you with the very rules you wielded as weapons. Margaret taught me that cruelty requires no fangs. I taught her that neither does justice.